It was an effort to wipe out an entire class of people, to keep those considered unfit from breeding more of the same. You think we're talking about Nazi Germany? We're not. It happened right here at home in Virginia for 50 years. The forced sterilizations of some 8,000 people. It was based on what is now recognized as a phony science called eugenics, and Hitler actually modeled his practices after Virginia's law. 12 years ago, I did an in-depth series on this subject, which led to an official apology from the state. But now some feel saying I'm sorry is just not enough. Tonight, part 1 of my series, Righting the Wrong. The stories are countless, but now those still alive to tell them are few. From the early 1900s all the way up to the late 70s, Virginia took thousands of children and young adults into a hospital room and robbed them of their right to have children. Most of them happened right here in Madison Heights at what was then known as the Lynchburg Colony for the Epileptics and Feeble-Minded.
I don't remember how old I was.
85-year-old Lewis Reynolds is among them. His father sent him to the colony because he was having seizures after being hit in the head by a rock.
But I didn't know they don't do all this other stuff. I thought he just put me over there to get well, and then I can come on back home.
Though the seizures were just his body's way of recovering, doctors there decided he had epilepsy, something they felt was a mental defect. And at age 13, Lewis was sterilized.
I didn't know what done. I don't know whether to give me a reason or not. I don't know.
Lewis didn't even learn he'd been sterilized until just a few years ago when his brother told him. Finally, he understood why he and his wife of 47 years could never have the children they so longed for. Did you try to have children?
Yeah, me and her did.
And you just never could? And you didn't know why?
And I asked to have both adopted two, a boy and a girl. So I have children, you know.
But his wife didn't want to adopt, so they lived, just the two of them, until she passed away about 5 years ago.
I was 11 when I went over there, but I was 23 when I was operated on.
Sarah Wiley has a similar story. Her brother, sister, and she were all sent to the colony and sterilized. Do you remember why you were at the training center?
My father was an alcoholic. They had to take me away from my mother and my daddy.
The state set up fraudulent hearings with phony advocates for the patients to authorize the operations. They told the victims they needed an operation for their health, sometimes threatening that they couldn't go home unless they had one. And they just told you needed an operation? Why did they tell you needed it?
Well, they just told me I needed one.
And you?
Before I can get away from the training center.
They said you had to have one before you could get away from there. Though she and many others tried to run away several times, Sarah didn't get away from there until she was 39.
The difference between us and Hitler, he shot him in the back of the head.
Mark Bold is a third-year law student and executive director of the Christian Law Institute in Lynchburg.
What happened here was a direct harm to individuals, to citizens, because based on their class, that their disability or they're labeled promiscuous or habitual criminal behavior or alcoholics, they were targeted for elimination. Ultimately, that's what it was about.
Bold is working hard to right the wrong for the atrocious acts led by Virginia's government.
What happened here was an evil social philosophy. It was based upon an evil social philosophy. The idea that, again, we wanted to eliminate people simply because of who they are and classes of people. And I can't think of anything that the government has done that's more egregious than that. Tomorrow night at 6, we're going to hear more about the effort underway for those victims. And if you'd like to watch my original series from 2000 that led to the state apology, we now have it posted at WSET.com. There you can see a more in-depth look at our eugenics history and its repercussions. It was a program designed to save taxpayers money. For 50 years, the state of Virginia sanctioned the sterilizations of nearly 8,000 people they considered mental misfits. The phony science of eugenics had them believing that they would give birth to more of the same and then become a financial burden to society. But many of those sterilized were simply just poor or uneducated. The state has since apologized, but now there's a movement to take it a step further. Tonight, the second part of my series, Righting the Wrong.
I cried because I couldn't have no children.
Lewis Reynolds didn't learn until recent years that he'd been sterilized as a child. He and his wife had tried to have children and never knew why they couldn't.
I want a family and I couldn't have one.
The state sanctioned his operation because they thought he had epilepsy, something they considered a mental defect. Lewis went on to serve his country in the Marines for 30 years. He fought in both Korea and Vietnam. When you learned you couldn't have children and you learned about the operation, how did you feel at the time?
Oh, I didn't feel very good. I feel sad.
Did you want children?
Yes, ma'am.
Sarah Wiley had a terrible time at the Lynchburg colony. Not only was she sterilized against her will, like many of the children there, she was treated like an inmate.
These were people, citizens, minding their own business, if you will, who were uprooted from their families, interned without any due process whatsoever, and then not only interned against their will, but they were then sterilized against their will. And so, if anybody should get compensation, again, we believe those people should be compensated.
Mark Bold with the Christian Law Institute is hoping the General Assembly will go beyond the apology issued some 10 years ago.
Virginia is not above the law. We have this a law in place that says when you do a wrong, your duty is to compensate.
Have you had seizures in a while? When's the last time you've had a, did you even know?
Delegate Patrick Hope from Arlington will champion the cause.
There are people still alive that are living with this, and by God, if we know who they are, we can let them come forward and tell their story. We ought to do something. They deserve at least that much.
Hope would like the state to form a task force, as they've just done in North Carolina, to track down what could be several hundred victims still living out of the thousands recorded in these books. From there, they can determine the right thing to do, even if that means paying reparations.
I hope my colleagues in the General Assembly will recognize this as something that we ought to do, not just for the individuals that were victimized, but for the state as a whole. The government needs to step up and take responsibility and just let these people come forward and tell their story.
Lynchburg Delegate Scott Garrett agrees the state's actions were reprehensible, but he worries this could lead Virginia down a slippery slope.
If we're going to say that one action of the state decades ago was so unjust that we need to today compensate the victims of that unjust act, I should think that there are other acts that folks could reasonably interpret as being unjust, and I'm not sure that we want to open that door.
Some are concerned about a slippery slope, but what we did, where we're standing at now, is ground zero for our American Holocaust.
Rainbow mess here.
Sarah Wiley is in a much happier place today, living with a caretaker. Still, she'd like to see the state pay for what they did to her. And do you feel like the state owes you something?
Yes, ma'am.
Lewis Reynolds feels the same.
I think they should pay for wrongdoing. I would like to get a little bit out of it to keep me going.
Mark Bold believes $50,000 would be a proper figure for reparations. He thinks Virginia needs to step up and do it before North Carolina, since our law paved the way for all the other states. But he's also suggesting a fitting tribute could be a museum similar to the Holocaust Museum. The Christian Law Institute is trying to get in touch with those involuntarily sterilized. And if you believe you were, you can call their hotline. There's the number right there, 888-643-7497. That number will be posted at WSET.com, along with a link to my original series on this subject.